Yay, we got it.
Okay.
Good afternoon, LEC community. Thank you for joining us for a really special edition of LEC. I don't know, LEC Live, whatever we call this. As you know, we have had a book study all July. We were reading Latina Teachers, Creating Careers, and I always forget the second part. Dr. Flores, what's the second
Starting
part?
culture.
And guarding culture. Yes, and we have several participants with us, which is really exciting. Thank you, Elizabeth Jensen and Elizabeth Maltier, for joining us this afternoon. And we're so lucky because Dr. Glenda Flores is with us, the author of Latina Teachers, and we get to pick her brain today. So, how's everyone doing? Dr. Flores, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited to join the LEC community today and to talk about, Latina teachers and to hear what other folks thought about it and their questions. And so I'm looking forward to it.
Elizabeth Jensen, how are you doing? You're muted.
We can't hear you.
Okay, I'm doing good, thank you.
Good. Elizabeth Maltier, how are you?
I'm doing okay. Just hoping my kids don't interrupt our stream, but work from home life, right?
Yes, seriously, my dogs, I'm on the same page with my dogs. So Dr. Flores, we as a group have been reading your book little by little throughout the month. We all the participants in our group are in such a variety of positions now, but most of us were Latinas. We did have participants that were not, which I always love in our book studies because it brings a different perspective and insight. Myself, I was a teacher for 6 years and I'm just now jumping in full time with the LEC. You heard a little bit from Elizabeth about their paths right now. And so it meant a lot. At least I'll speak for myself, but I'm sure Elizabeth agree that it meant a lot to read from a perspective that we could all relate to. That is not very common, especially here in the Kansas City area. Our teacher population is majority white women, which is, of course, the norm and the average in our country. So it was really nice to dive into a perspective that we could all relate to. But Dr. Flores, tell us about what you do now and kind of what got you there.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that, it was something that resonated with your experiences or that it touched upon it in some ways. But what I do now is I am a professor at the University of California, Irvine. I'm in the Department of Chicano Latino Studies with an affiliation in sociology. And so most of my work focuses on Latinos or Latinx individuals that kind of like, for many of them, defy the odds, many who might have been from working class origins, and they, navigate higher education and enter the white collar world. So I started first with teachers or educators, and now I'm moving a little bit more into medicine or Latinos in medicine. And I guess what propelled me to study Latina teachers. So one is, when I was an undergrad, I was studying to become an elementary school teacher. My dream was to go back to my old elementary school, and specifically, to be a bilingual teacher. And, I noticed when I was taking a lot of my classes, I took a multicultural education class, and they would place you, or you could request, right, to be at an elementary school. And I requested to be at a school in the Santa Ana Unified School District. And I think from there is where I saw, oh, like, why are some of the teachers saying these things, or why, are they having these issues with parents? And I always felt like sometimes the parents would come, even though I was only, an aide at the time, and they would ask, or they would just say, "Señorita," or, "Ma'am, can you help me? I'm trying to figure this out." Um, and so I felt like, yeah, I was kind of guiding them, even to them to a classroom, or talking to their child if they were having trouble transitioning. And I think that's where it inspired the book, because I saw that there were a lot of negative comments about culture, and I thought, what, why is this still happening? And I thought, can't there be a way to think about Latinx like cultures as an asset, right? Or in a way that we can use and tap into to help students. And so yeah, so that's how it started. And I had a really good advisor who was also Latina. And she, told me, oh, well, why don't you do a study on Latina teachers, when I went for a doctoral program. And what's funny is that at the time I didn't really see someone like me that I thought, oh, can I do that? And I ended up pursuing it, but I still felt like my heart is in education K through 12. And so I was happy that I had an advisor that said, "You can still do this, and you can still be in the schools and remain closely attached." And so I started doing, research with Latina teachers in Santa Ana, which was mostly a Mexican, Central American immigrant city. And then it kind of grew for the book, and Latina teachers. It's about teachers who work in Compton and in another school in Rosemead, because I wanted to look at, race relations. But I can talk about, Santa Ana if people have questions about that. And I think, it's really timely to have this conversation, because there was just an article that was published out by a Professor Mead. And, there is like kind of like a petition circulating, because it still has a lot of this culture of poverty perspective. And I was, looking at it, and I thought, wow, like at first that it got published, and then second that these ideas still linger. And yeah, so.
That's interesting, that your work was a lot in Santa Ana. We actually have several people in our community here in Kansas City that are from Santa Ana.
Oh,
Yeah, and I think both of them, TFA brought them here to Kansas City. So you hit on a lot of notes that came up in our discussion. For example, you talked about your advisor and how that kind of led you down this path. You talked about the fact that as a Latina aide, you acted like as a cultural guardian, which I know comes up in your book, and we had an extensive conversation about, because we all have that experience in our schools. So Elizabeth Jansen or Mountier, any thoughts or questions to start us off?
Well, it seems that a lot of your research you have done in California, in that area, and so it's nice to see what has happened there, because I have been living in the Midwest since I came from Colombia. So it was great to learn more about that. Have you done other research maybe from other places? Because I bet that also is kind of different from like Florida or New York or the Midwest, maybe there are some aspects that we can relate to, but there are other differences. Have you done something like that too?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Elizabeth, because since my work is focused on California, and there's more, at least more, Latina teachers in the schools here in certain areas. So I haven't studied in or done like research in another state, but my first publication on Latina teachers was called Racialized Tokens. Latina teachers surviving, thriving in a white woman's profession. And it compared and contrasted, the experiences of Latina teachers that worked in schools where they were the lonely only, right? Maybe only one of two, and most of the other teachers in the school were white. And that was in Santana. And then I looked at, compared it to Latina teachers that worked in schools where there were like 30 of them, right? Which is really unheard of. A lot of them would say, I'm in a white collar profession where the majority of my coworkers are other Latinas, and that's pretty much like unheard of. But for those that were working as the one of two or maybe just two, it came with a lot of like obstacles or just different hurdles that they had to go through. Like maybe they had to shoulder a lot of the workload themselves. They were called on to do a lot of other tasks for other teachers. They often, even though they might have seen like their culture as like something positive that they tapped into, they also met with resistance from other teachers. And so that's why I say that it was racialized tokens, because a lot of them also had to deal with, comments, negative comments about like immigration, and, kind of like fielding a lot of things about these topics, and sometimes, being vocal about it and saying, hey, that's not right. And other times feeling very like just emotionally drained from hearing a lot of those things, and there is, like attrition of, teachers leaving the profession. But for a lot of the Latina teachers, like in the schools that I talked to, many of them felt like because the majority of the school district and the school was Latina or Latinx, feeling like, of being like, I'm needed here, right? Like I have to do something, and so there was a lot of that kind of like pull for them.
Touched on, sorry, Elizabeth, I'm going to summarize. Touched on something that comes up for us as an organization a lot, which is that the average, or the Latino teacher is the fastest growing in America, fastest growing demographic, but also unfortunately the quickest to leave, with the national average of Latinos leaving after 3 years versus the 5 years for the national average. That came up a lot in our past book study as well, with Hilda Ochoa's book, and also with this book, which is that all of us have this sentiment of like just a little bit of burnout sometimes, where playing the role of cultural guardian on top of our roles as teachers and advisors and counselors really impacts our energy levels and how difficult this work is. So thanks for touching on that, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I was going to ask, so you mentioned, the teachers, and we always talk about how representation matters, right? Having Latinx teachers. So did you have Latinx teachers in your school experience? And if so, how do you feel that impacted your work?
When I think of like, did I ever have a Latinx teacher when I was younger? Probably not until I was older, maybe high school. was my first, my teacher that was a Spanish teacher, and she was Cubana. What's really interesting is that when I went back to the elementary schools to do one of my studies, they told me that one of the teachers that I had was multiracial, or Latina and white. And I think at that time it didn't compute, or what didn't resonate that way, because the surname was different. And I think, you know, when I interviewed other teachers, they would say, oh, you know, that they were Latina, but the way that they were like brought up didn't, you know, have like a similar experience in some ways. And I think maybe because the bilingualism wasn't there. So, but then for me, I was like, oh, like, it makes sense, you know, like just being in the classroom, and how it made me think of some of the later generation Latina teachers that did what they could, you know, to try to connect with the students. And I remember that this teacher, it was the teacher that, you know, I felt like really molded us and pushed us so much. And I still have these things that she gave us. She gave all of the students when we graduated, and she told me, like, later on, she's like, you all were like the best class. And I believe it. Okay, I don't know if they say it to every class, but she gave us these pencils, and each pencil had our name like engraved in it in gold. And so I still have them because she gave us 3 of them in different colors. And it was, to me, it just symbolized like, wow, you know, it's a pencil with my name on it, and so much to have, you know, a teacher give them to us. And then to learn later on that, oh, she was Latina, right? And she was connecting with us. And so to me, it was just so meaningful that I still have them, and I'm thinking I need to like mount them somewhere. But I think in Santana is where I did have like other teachers that I interviewed, that one was like Puerto Rican, another one was Peruvian. And when I interviewed them, like the Peruvian teacher, she was, you know, blonde with blue eyes, and her Spanish was, you know, really, you know, articulated well, but she would say, you know, I'm white presenting, but you know, I'm here, I'm committed to like the students. And it was, you know, it was just really like they were so diverse, and they acknowledged that, and they knew, you know, like the differences between them, but like the goal to help students was pretty similar. So
Dr. Flores, something we like to do when anybody brings up a teacher that made a difference for them, we love for them to shout them out, because I don't know, you know, we're on the internet right now. And so maybe somewhere in the internet world, that teacher can see the impact you made. So if you don't mind, who was the teacher that stuck with you, that gave you the pencils?
So the teacher that, you know, stuck with me and gave me the pencils, her name is Mrs. Barbara. I think that's her first name, because sometimes we don't know them. Mrs. Barbara Cosson. And I think what was so special is that she would team teach with another teacher, and the other teacher was Mrs. Bernard. And I just remember that they just work so well together. So yeah.
Okay, so Mrs. Bernard and Mrs. What was the first one?
Barbara Cosson.
Mrs. Cosson, call out to you and the
Yeah. Yes. I still have the pencils. I still have the pencils that they're not even sharpened, because I'm like, I don't, you know.
Yeah. Okay, so universe, help us find teachers and share our appreciation for them. We have someone joining, Martin Clark. was also a part of our book study, so he'll hop on and ask his questions as well. You talked about, just now you talked about biculturalism and how you had interviewed a teacher who was white and Latina. If you don't mind, did she bring up any way, you know, she felt disconnected from her Latina identity, or maybe felt disconnected from her white identity, and how that impacted her role as a teacher?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I found, especially with the teachers that in the book, right, that worked in Rosemead, there were a lot more teachers there that were later generation. I think I talk about one teacher that was Mexican and Irish, and how, you know, all of the effort that she would put in to like connect with students, but also not being able to articulate herself in the language anymore. And just saying how she felt like sometimes a sense of loss, or she kind of felt sometimes, or she would say that she was letting parents down because she felt like, oh, you know, I like the communication was hard. But she would also say that she talked about like the immigrant narrative in her classroom, and talk about her grandfather's experience working, you know, in a very tough job to kind of like find parallels in the experiences with her students. So it was really interesting for me, like interviewing the teachers there. And I think in the appendix, I talk more about how some of the teachers that were later gen that, you know, might have all not been able to speak Spanish anymore or lost it along the way, because it happens, especially in the third generation. It's, I think people say the United States is the graveyard of languages because they, you know, if they're not supported, they kind of like vanish. And I think a lot of them were, when I would interview them, were worried that I would judge them. And I thought, this is new to me, you know, because they thought that it would lead to these like authenticity kind of questions. And I'm like, there is no like authentic Latinx experience. But it was just interesting to like navigate that.
Again, you know, you're bringing up, sorry, I think I'm freezing, but you're bringing up things that come up often in community conversations, which is the intersectionality, one of them being the intersectionality of all of our identities, and how some of us including me, are working through dismantling what we have perceived as what a Latino or what a Latinx person is.
Mm-hmm.
And so giving, you know, space for those conversations to happen is really important to us as an organization. Martin and Marta, thank you so much for joining us. Feel free to jump in. We've gotten started, as you can see, with Dr. Flores. Martin, Marta, any questions or thoughts that you want to bring into conversation?
Or introductions.
That's right. I'm sorry. Please introduce yourself, of course.
Sorry, I apologize for coming late. So Dr. Flores, my name is Marta Silva, and I'm a teacher of heritage education in a school here in Olathe. Heritage education is my passion. So everything that you talk about, the linguistic part of your book that I'm enjoying very much is wonderful, because I think we all share here a common framework of racial linguistics and social linguistics approaches to who our students are, and the fluidity that goes with it. And you said it, there's not authenticity, there's not right or wrong. And that's very important message for teachers, Latino teachers, and teachers that teach any student what he's not it from a mainstream position. So I'm so happy to see you. Thank you for your work.
Thank you so much for joining.
How you doing, Dr. Flores? I'm Dr. Martin Clark. I work on Fort Leavenworth. I teach military adult learners. I'm also an adjunct at Kansas City, Kansas Community College, where I teach the GED students there. So I thought your book was amazing. I especially love the part where you talk about cultural guardians, and your words about biculturalism. I thought that was great. And it absolutely hit home for me. So just loved your book. I'm so glad I found this whole series that Susanna is doing, and it's just fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining, Dr. Clark. You know, I admire at UC Irvine, they just launched like a veteran studies, like a certificate program, because we're having more, you know, at least I had like a student that was doing a research project on veterans that are like reintegrating and getting like their BAs. So yeah.
I love it when universities do that. It was kind of what happened to me when I retired in 07. I didn't have a degree at all, and I kind of I went to Colorado and started working online and just kind of got the bug, and pretty much went straight through from 07 to 18 when I finished finally with my doctorate. So yeah, I love schools that do those kinds of programs.
Marta, Dr. Clark, any questions? We've gotten an opportunity to go through a couple, but I'm sure something sparked up as you were reading. Any thoughts?
Well, my thought and comment to you, and I think this touched home with me. I'm sponsor and leader of the Latina Leadership Club in my high school, and I find myself having to bend rules. And you talk about that, about how Latina teachers often find it, and I'm quoting you, necessary to stretch and bend scholar rules, state and district policies. A lot of times, because I'm an immigrant, I came here when I was 25. I can't pretend I didn't know these rules. And there's a lot of rules that don't make any sense to me from a foreigner's point of view. And they're very normal to everybody else, right? So I've been playing dumb kind of to be able to do a lot of things that they look very natural to the American mind, but they're not as natural to the foreigner. And I wanted to ask you, one of the things that impacted me the most is how teachers in general, educators in general, are not very critical of the system that is imposed upon us. And I come from a transition, Spain, a transition to a democracy where we criticized everything and we marched the streets with anything that happened. And so we're very, very critical and very open and very direct. And then being part of the school system here, I feel like it's what is rewarded is the silence and the applying the rules. And how do we convey that message of criticism and radical protest to our students without making them be in trouble? You know, so is that, how do you keep that balance where that criticism, even if they say it's welcome, the critical thinking, but I have not experienced that welcoming. So what are your recommendations for all teachers, right, of Latino students?
Yeah, I really like you know, your question, because it makes me think of when I worked in an after school program before I did substitution. There was one young Latino boy that I love so much because he was so critical of the world, and but he was also so disciplined, like so much, because the things that he would say were, you know, what he's saying is actually right, but they just wanted him to stop, you know, saying it. Like, well, why? He would say things like, well, why am I getting, you know, punished so much for saying this? And he was really just conscious, like he already critically conscious at like elementary school. And to me, it was like I had to tell him, you know, everything that you're saying is, I understand everything that you're saying, and just be yourself, but I know that you're going to get policed so much. And I think, you know, and how I talk about the book, a lot of it was about assimilation. And that's what was being, you know, pushed upon on a lot of students. You know, and I think at the time, a lot of people were thinking, you know, this is the way that they will be accepted, and that they will be allowed to like incorporate, if you just shed your ethnic origins, right? And I think over time, especially in the context that we're at now, people were seeing, well, that's not working. You know, there is still a lot of punishing of you know, people. And so I do see with like the youth of today that they are, you know, kind of resisting, being met in different ways. And it just makes me think of like this breaking the rules, because I talk about in the book, like even speaking Spanish, right? At one of the schools in Compton, that was like a big breaking the rule. But in other schools, you know, dual immersion schools, it's like something that is embraced, right? And allowed, and it comes with different achievement outcomes in the long run for students. But yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that's what I was noticing about how some of the teachers would just kind of like circumvent their rules, or do things that were, you know, they knew that if I need to do this to help this family, right? So that they don't face any more like consequences for just existing.
You know, I just had a conversation. Shout out to my Surge sister, Jacqueline Rodriguez. She's doing some good work over in Kansas City, Kansas Public Schools. We just had a conversation this morning about how so many bilingual programs call or, you know, frame language learning as a negative thing. Like, okay, we have to get rid of that native language and like get to this English standard. And so I love that she's doing work over there to change the wording and just the language around how we interact with students. And she used the term this morning of emergent bilinguals. So kind of a more positive take on the fact that students are learning English, and a very positive strength of knowing more than one language, right? And so, Marta, what you're hitting on is like just this negative tone oftentimes around our students' paths to learning, and oftentimes on our teachers too, right? Like Latinx teachers having to mold and assimilate and adjust to systems. So yes, for sure. Thoughts? Any other questions, participants?
I think in the book, I also talked about how, you know, there are like these systems that are so ingrained. And in one of the chapters, I talk about how myself, like even myself, I became co-opted over time when it came to the testing, where initially I was very like, you know, and then over time it was more of like, oh, well, that would be this, you know, or I would score this way. And one of the questions that I got once was, should we just eliminate, right, all like high stakes testing? And I thought, you know, there have been like different tests that have been developed over time. Like, I think I remember when I was in elementary school, it might have been called something like CTBS or something like that. But then I thought, you know, there will probably be like some other way that that people would be categorized, and like a different hierarchy would emerge. And yeah, so that's a tough one.
I'm also reading How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Ibram Kendi talks about how standardized testing led us to believe that there's an achievement gap. And really what it should be called, he says, is an opportunity gap. Because there is no way to standardize learning. There is no way to standardize assessments and standardize how we assess students' takeaways of what they're learning. And so I found that really interesting because, like you said, Dr. Flores, as a teacher, you do kind of fall into like, okay, this is the most important part of the year. Make sure you're sleeping. Make sure you eat breakfast. Make sure you remember all the acronyms that I taught you this year, so you know how to approach this kind of question and this kind of question. When really what we want kids to take away is long-term learning. So yes. Any other thoughts?
Well, if I may, the fact of the matter is that those tests open so many doors. We talked about that. And we want it or not, they open doors, financial doors to college. So that's one of the ethical things that, you know, and we commented it when we read your book on, you know, on the one side, I have two sons, both, you know, now in college, and one of them got a lot of tutoring because I didn't know what those tests were, and then he got a fantastic grade on ACT. He has a full ride, fantastic. Then I became more critical, so I didn't push my second one that much because, you know what, it was, and then he didn't, and we didn't get the financial assistance that, so we're kind of paying physically for not conforming to the system. Although, you know, it just, so and I have a third one and I have to make a decision. So, you know, it just is, and even, so I tell my students, the system is like this, and it goes against certain categories of people that you put in. But even if you tell that to the students, then they're gonna take a test where they know that it's against themselves and in their psyche, how is that gonna impact their performance? So there's so many questions there. I mean, as you say, the system, everything is so engraved in the system that in our students for 14 to 18, they still not at that point in life like we are, that they can say, screw this, and we're just gonna, you know, we're just gonna look for a community, do our work, and disrupt the system. I think they have to navigate that in, but we have to be honest with those families, because I want my students to go to college, and I want them to access those scholarships, and I want them to go to the schools that they want to, and I know that they have to go through that hoop in order to be able to do that. So ethically, you know, it's just like I would not be able to sleep well if I completely ignore the racist system, and on the other hand, I don't want to prepare them to live in a racist system.
Yeah, I definitely think it's tough because even if we think about like tests like the GRE, right? We know that the tests are like biased and they don't measure who is actually going to succeed in a program at all. But the one thing is that those tests are used to determine funding from schools, right? Like, oh, if they're going to give you a fellowship or not. And so it's you know, something that like the schools use to measure. I know that at least in the UC system, they just made a decision that to eliminate, you know, I think it's the GRE as like an admission requirement. And so we'll see, you know, how it plays out. But I always, you know, in my head, I think, you know, there's always maybe some other way that these like hierarchies or inequities will manifest themselves. So
yeah, and we're talking about, you know, dismantling systems and all of that. And one of the things that I noticed in the book, several of the Latinx teachers made statements that were really overtly anti-Black. This idea that Black people have somehow arrived and that now we just need to be kind of almost like pitted against each other, you know, and fight for the crumbs, and that there's, you know, versus this idea of coalition building, right? So what are your thoughts on that, and kind of how did you manage hearing some of those things as a researcher?
Yeah, so thank you so much for this question. So one of the things about, you know, that chapter, when I went and I thought, oh, this is what I want to research. I want to look at, you know, teachers and race relations and how they come together, right? Like I was looking at coalition, and that's what I went in doing this study. And when I got to the schools, there was some of that, but more than anything, it was about, you know, worries about, you know, keeping your job. And so then I thought, oh, okay, now I'm seeing other themes. And so one of the chapters in the book, I think it's chapter 4, that was the hardest one for me to write, because there was anti-Black sentiment that was being expressed by some of the teachers. And I was hesitating writing it, and until I had, you know, my advisor, because I would have to, you know, share my like notes and my transcripts of what I found. And she's like, you know, kind of giving me that push of, you have to write about some of the you know, the positive themes that you're seeing, and then, but also the ones that are more, you know, difficult to like talk about, but they need to be written so that people can see what these patterns are and what it looks like. So in chapter 4, and I talk about it as like racialization of space, right? And how people talk about the space, but also they're expressing, you know, these anti-Black sentiments. And I got some question, like a question once about, well, do you think that your you know, what you found would still hold today, like would it be relevant? And I said, you know, I honestly think that, especially like when COVID was happening, that there might have been more that would have happened in the Asian Latino school. Because we saw a lot of stereotypes that were coming out directed towards Asians. And so I thought, that might, you know, have been something that would have played out in the school in a certain way that I didn't capture, right, in the book. But I think that might have, you know, come out. And yeah, and I think, you know, today where we've seen a lot more social movements, for me, it would be, I think there was one Latina teacher that was Afro-Latina, or who identified that way. And she was pretty aware, right, of what was going on, and saying, it's like, the system is like, it's having us fight for crumbs when we should be, you know, trying to work together. But it was all about, you know, the resources that were being allocated to the school. And yeah, definitely like these sentiments of Compton, you know, being historically, right, once it was white, then it became more African American, and now it's predominantly Latino immigrant, of that there are no resources, right, for African American students, and they're kind of like being frozen and like pushed out. So, and then that's all like the effects of like the structure kind of coming down and making people feel like, oh, very stuck.
Yeah, you know, that goes along with what a lot of our conversation revolved around, which is a decision that as educators we have to make. Like, do we prepare our students to adjust to these regimes, or to dismantle them and you know, break them up? What would you say? We had some interaction from our community on Facebook. What would you say to someone who would mention that in the book, it felt sometimes like our teachers or our students should try to work with the inequality. The word used was inequality regimes rather than dismantling them. I know that, you know, I think we're also in a phase in our country where we're moving more toward this dismantling. I think when my parents immigrated from Mexico in the 80s and early 90s, I think then it was overwhelmingly the feeling of let's assimilate, let's figure out what this country is like, and let's be, you know, successful, or what the vision of successful was. And now in the light of, you know, no, like these systems are racist. And like you just mentioned, like these structures that really put a lot of pressure on our Latinx educators. What would you say to our community members that perhaps would rather see the dismantling than the adjusting and assimilating to it?
This is a really good question because, you know, I think one of the quotes maybe in the preface of the book is by Audre Lorde, and it says it's about the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And it may be, you know, beat them, but it will never like fully bring about change. I probably didn't say it verbatim, but you know, yes, and that's what I was working with. And thinking, okay, the master's tool, and just having these conversations. If you work within the system, right, can you throw a wrench in there and like make, you know, kind of like cause it to like, ooh, something happened, and now, you know, and so I think that's where I was coming at the book in terms of talking about Latina teachers and how they're it's like a quiet revolution, like where it's happening, and it's, you know, kind of like you know, coming in there and you know, making these kind of daily modifications, changes that might seem that they're insignificant, small, but they are meaningful. They can, maybe they will be very meaningful to the students in their classrooms and to the parents. And I, you know, I think about that structure of the book is it brings you up, and then it gives you a chapter that like, it kind of brings you back down, and then it brings you up again, and then you read another chapter that's like, and then it, you know, yeah, I think that's a good question, and definitely something that, you know, folks can debate. I definitely think that we are seeing that this whole idea about assimilating and you know, that will make people think, oh, that's how they're gonna incorporate, and we've seen that like even with other scholars that's kind of what they've been pushing, and I think now we're seeing that you know, a lot of folks are like, nope. Yeah.
And that does not come with positive thoughts and feelings all the time, speaking from experience. So especially in a system that is so antiquated and that has been around forever but wasn't built for Latinx students and Latinx professionals, educators.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that, yeah, like in the preface it has that quote by Audre Lorde and then one by Karl Marx, right, about just that most of the teachers, the Latinx teachers, not all of them, but a lot of them were from like working class origins, right? And they were like the first, and they're kind of like entering this profession, but with all of like, you know, the struggles of their family and like the familial context. And so it's you know, coming in and then also making these changes in the ways that they can. So.
And it seems like many of these teachers also want to find stability, you know, so just trying to start fighting, it kind of shake maybe their positions, you know, but things are changing now because they are teachers for second, third, fourth generation. So things start changing a little bit. and maybe in that fact it can be less fear, you know, losing their jobs, and maybe be more strong, and to try to participate more in the administration area, not just in the teaching, because you can do a lot of things day by day with your students, with some of the practices, which I like that you mentioned in the book with the math, you know, taking some, trying to incorporate culture into the different context areas, but at the same time to start changing some of the policies, you know, maybe in your school, in the school district, you know, at different levels. And it's there where I'm not sure with your research, how many teachers go to that administration part, you know, or to advocate more where they can make bigger changes.
Yeah, that's a good question. Like how many of you know, the teachers that I interviewed ended up like moving up to like other positions, or like this vertical mobility within the profession. So I would say that the majority of the teachers that I interviewed at Compton and in Goodwill Elementary, the pseudonyms I gave them, they're still working in their classrooms. So they've remained right in as working as teachers, the majority of them. In Santana, some of the teachers that I had interviewed, and this was, you know, a while ago, have moved up right to like maybe school board or like district positions. But it you know, so there is some like movement within the profession. But I think that what was happening in Compton is, well, I do say there was a lot of turnover. And 1 year there was like so many teachers that just came and went. But what was going on in Compton was a lot of the racial dynamics, especially in terms of the district. And you would hear like the fear from some of the teachers, right, where they would push the parents or say, hey, you can go to the district and like fight for yourself and this and that, and the parents kind of being reluctant. But also some of them were reluctant themselves too, like the teachers of you know, of losing their jobs, or like they were all trying to keep right their job also for their own financial security, and because they were financially like solventing themselves, but also their families. Sometimes they were like the safety net for their parents or for extended relatives. So.
Marta, I see your hand up. If you want to go ahead.
Sure. Just to maybe look at the future, these fantastic new generations that we have. And my school offers a Future Educators of America branch kind of for students. So what would you be your advice based on your research, your advice for Latina girls who would like to become educators? What do's and don'ts based on what you have experienced yourself, but also researched and talked to other women who are Latina teachers?
Yeah, so we're in an interesting time right now because a lot of the learning is happening remotely, and it's gonna be tough, I would say, because I think we're already seeing that it's revealing more of the, you know, the inequities that a lot of families are dealing with. And my advice would be to try to do like as well in like your classes as you can, to, you know, I know it's hard for a lot of students that are gonna, if they're remote and there's a lot going on, there might be a lot going on at home. And I was having this conversation with other like students in undergrad, right, about getting a college education and getting like their BA. I think it's so important to do that, especially for women of color, because, you know, there's still like the wage gap that women of color experience. And even when they have like a BA, right, but you need I think it carries something that is so important to get for like yourself, but also just because there is this credentials inflation that even employers like look at, and they will look at that like in a CV or a resume. And yeah, I think it's, to get, at least like your BA or your MA or your higher education, and to rely on your family, because these institutions are kind of set up so that certain students, right, succeed, and everybody else is like balancing like this and that and so yeah, that would be my advice for not just like Latin for like women, but for for men, for all Latinx individuals. Dr. Clark?
Oh, I didn't hear you. Sorry. I have a couple comments. Something that really resonated when I was reading your book was how you talk about a lot of the Latina women are kind of just gravitate towards the education field. And that really struck home because both my parents were educators for years and years. And my mom and her family came over from Mexico in the 20s. And none of them, my grandparents especially, had really any kind of education. So the first gen was my mom, and then her and my dad are both educators for years. And then I was thinking, the schooling that I've done has predominantly been with women. So it is really just a large field that has mainly women in it, which, is no big deal to me. But I just, when I was reading your book, I was like, wow, that is so true. I had noticed it, but I was like, wow, because, I had a cohort of 16 and there were 3 guys in it. And I'm like, wow, it just kind of blew my mind that it really struck me.
Yeah, I mean, definitely it's, what's interesting is that, in the past, it was more, it was Latino men that were, going to like higher education and entering like the professional jobs and occupations. And that's kind of like switched, where even, in the classes that I teach, it's majority women. And yeah, and I think in teaching, it's that it's, a feminized occupation. I would say that for the Latinas, a lot of them, when I interviewed them, they were studying for other fields, right? Or they were saying, oh, I was studying math, I was studying biology. And because of, what they saw in terms of, oh, who's getting the job in this area, like they thought education was more open to them, or a place where they would be able to, get a job, and also to once they were in there, right, like in the occupation, to help students. But what's interesting is, since now I'm interviewing physicians, I can only think of one physician right now, but she said her mom was a teacher, and how her mom kind of went through a lot of the the giving back to her parents, and a lot of these like gendered cultural constraints. Right. And for her, it was like, no, you move away to, another state and this and that. So it was like different now. So.
Yeah, I completely agree. The second point I had was, when you talk about how a lot of students and teachers are almost expressly told not to use your native language, not to speak in Spanish. I think, I used to live in Europe for 10 years, and it's mandatory you take another language over there. Like, I lived in Germany forever, and you take 8 years mandatory English. You don't have a choice. And they embrace it. I mean, Europe especially, they just fully embrace knowing multiple languages. And I'm like, why not here. You know, we have such a diverse culture. Why not grasp onto knowing these other languages and their cultures and their history and all the, you know, the richness that comes with it? Why not, especially with our kids, say, hey, grab that, learn from it, soak it all in. It boggles my mind that we don't do that over here.
Yeah, I would say that in Europe, it's pretty it's the norm to see people
Right.
that speak like 3 or 4 languages.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, it's like, hey, you know, oh, these are the languages that I speak, and these are and over here it does not seem to be that way at all.
Yeah, it just makes no sense.
Yeah.
Well, that makes me, it reminds me a little bit of in the book when you talk about the Asians family, where they meet like on Saturdays and they have their own school, you know?
Mhm.
And in fact, I have friends that they do that, Asian families. And at one point, I kind of wanted to have like a escuelita, you know, because I did it with my own kids, but I wanted to do it with other families, you know, because once you are very, how you say, you feel very confident with your own language, your own culture, and then you can extrapolate some of those elements to the new language, the new culture. And unfortunately, many of the bilingual programs have been working very good. But uh, I have a question from there. It's like, I noticed that many of the Hispanic families depend a lot of different resources that the government give in order for the students to be successful. So we have the ELL classes, those kind of things. And parents also get other resources. But it seems like Asian families sometimes, or other groups, they don't get always like a translator, you know, interpreter or things or other resources, but they still seems like we have this stereotype that the Asians are, like you mentioned in the book, more intelligent, you know, they get to these type of jobs, you know, while the Hispanic kids, you know, they have the stigma, you know, on these kind of jobs. So how we can help in the classroom so we don't, uh, how you say, like perpetrate, we help the families, the kids, but at the same time not make them to become like dependent, because it's how as a culture is, we depend psychologically, financially, many times from one another, and that's why many times we get back to our families. But how we can't help our families, our kids.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I would say that in terms of like resource allocation, so the school that I went to in Rosemead, so they're like their Asian American population was very diverse in terms of socioeconomic status, and Asians have, like, you know, a very wide gap in terms of, you know, SES, in terms you have like some that are very like poor and others that are doing well. And I think what was happening at that school is that you had there's this concept of immigrant selectivity, right? And that immigrants to the US are selected along multiple lines. So sometimes Asians are more likely to be selected for their like skills, like high technology skills, whereas a lot of Latinos are selected for like their low labor, like low wage labor. And so that already, you know, kind of you start seeing like in education how it affects, because for some Asian families, right, they might have they migrated over here, but they had high status jobs in the home country, or they might have had a college background in the home country, and that, you know, kind of helps over here in the United States. And I'll also say that the school in Rosemead received a lot of funding from very wealthy Asian corporations, like Panda Express, and things like that. So in some ways, you know, a lot of the Latino families would say that they wanted their children to go to this school because they would also be able to access, right, some of those resources that were a little bit difficult for them to have accumulated in their lives.
there is, I mean, I think we could talk to you, Dr. Flores, all day about the book, about things that arise in the book that are so relevant to 2020. I mean, you know, the book was written in a time that much of what's happening today was also happening then, but with COVID, and I mean, these things just came up. Inequity and all of the components of inequity came up so often. So we could talk to you all day long, but unfortunately, our time is up. Dr. Flores, we completely just so much appreciate, first of all, you taking your time to do this research and to write this book. As you probably know, there's not many books like this book. There aren't very many authors, at least in the past, that have done this work. And so seeing Latinas like you do that work is very inspiring to me personally. I'm sure to the other Latinas in the group and to Latinx people in our community, I mean, and beyond, right? And of course, thank you so much for taking this afternoon to chat with us. Any final thoughts or questions for us?
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Susana, for putting all of this together and for inviting me. And, you know, I was really inspired by Gilda's book, The Learning from Latino Teachers. And so that's kind of where, you know, the direction that I was headed in, and just looking at it in a race relations kind of angle. But I really admire all of the work that everyone in this group is doing. And, you know, I am sending everybody positive vibes for the upcoming, right, school year. So we will make it, we will do it.
Yes, we all need the positive vibes and we appreciate them. Participants, thank you so much for joining the LEC this month. Be on the lookout because I've chosen our book for August. So be on the lookout for what that book is. Dr. Flores, always keep in touch and let us know how we can support your work.
All right, thank you so much. And if anybody has other questions, you can send me an email, of course.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Bye.